Although Florida is not remembered for the kind of violence that characterized 1950s and 60s civil rights struggles in other southern states, there was a time in the spring and summer of 1964 when events in St. Augustine made front-page news in the civil rights movement. In spring 2004, I listened as some of the front-line participants told their stories.
We have a tendency to romanticize this thing. It wasn't nothing nice about what was happening to people back then, not only us. There's a whole lot of people struggled.
St. Augustine civil rights activist Samuel White. White was in St. Petersburg recently, part of a University of South Florida conference on the history of the state's civil rights movement.
Like a brother shared to me, he said somebody from St. Augustine told him that probably wasn't never there, said that we was marching one night and we knelt and prayed in the crowd, back door. That never happened. The crowd kept coming with bricks and bottles and bats and stuff.
The worst situation I was in was not in Birmingham, although Birmingham was a terrible place. The worst riot I was in was not in Birmingham, it's in St. Augustine.
One of the key players in the civil rights movement, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. In the early 60s, St. Augustine remained a rigidly segregated city, dominated by the established politics of white racism. But in the summer of 1963, a St. Augustine dentist and former Air Force pilot Robert Haling began organizing young people to sit in on behalf of the NAACP. On June 23rd, 16 young blacks, including 7 juveniles, were arrested for sitting in at lunch counters of 2 local drugstores.
We stayed in jail overnight, and then the judge informed our parents that we could only get out if we signed a petition stating that we would not demonstrate until we was 21. We told our parents not to sign.
When the parents of Joanne Anderson, Samuel White, Audrey Nell Edwards, and one other student refused to sign the paper, the 4 were sentenced to 6 months in Florida juvenile reform facilities. Edwards remembers the efforts of their attorney at the sentencing.
L.J. Shaw told Judge Matthews that he would take our case to a high court. The judge told our attorney, I don't care where you take this. We make the law here in St. Augustine, and we break it.
But despite their arrogance, the ruling establishment was beginning to feel threatened. The demonstrations were provoking beatings, shootings, and other forms of intimidation from groups like the KKK, which at that time included many charged with enforcing the law. Activist and former Gainesville Mayor Gene Chalmers remembers driving to St. Augustine to post bail for a friend.
We got to the jail and pulled into the parking lot, and I looked in the back seat of the sheriff's cars that were lined up there, and there were the Klan robes in those cars.
In spring 1964, invited by Haling and other local leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference picked St. Augustine as a place to make a stand. The timing was important. A bill to outlaw racial segregation in public places was stalled in the U.S. Senate. King began speaking in local churches, preaching the doctrine of nonviolence and organizing nightly marches to and from the historic slave market in the heart of the old city.
I never will forget the night I saw one of the marches.
Former state's attorney Dan Warren was instrumental in bringing blacks and whites together during and after the conflict.
Young children leading the way, holding hands and singing softly, "We shall overcome." And they marched into the jaws of almost death because the Klansmen waiting in the park were ready to pounce on them at a moment's notice.
We all was going downtown and we heard all these shotguns and all these guns. And he told anyone, if they didn't want to go on with the march with us, they could turn around. But we was going to go on with that march. And he prayed. They threw all kind of stuff in our faces. They were shooting shotguns. That's the night he thought he was going to die, because he went on with this march.
One evening, Reverend Willie Bolden, then a young freedom rider, marched next to future Atlanta Mayor and UN Ambassador Andrew Young to a confrontation in front of the slave market.
There were 1,000 or 1,200 angry whites there. They were doing everything they could to scare us. And Andy was slapped in the mouth with that slapjack and knocked to the ground. And I remember picking Andy up, and we stood there, and the guy hit Andy a second time, knocking him down. And I remember our training, and I took Andy Young's head and put it in the pit of my stomach, and took my head and covered it with my hand and pulled myself up in the fetal position, and the guy commenced hitting on me.
That summer, other struggles took place at restaurants and motels and at the beach. Along with Birmingham and Montgomery, TV and radio coverage of the violence was making St. Augustine a civil rights hotspot. Finally, on June 19, 1964, the United States Senate passed the Civil Rights Act. Clennon King is producer of the documentary film Slave Market Diary.
In order for nonviolence to work, you needed violence, and it came at St. Augustine. St. Augustine became that place, in large part, where so many things converged. And ultimately, Dr. King left the streets of St. Augustine and went straight to the White House to see the Civil Rights Bill signed into law.
I'm Bill Dudley. With funding from the Florida Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, this report was produced by the Florida Humanities Council. Visit us on the web at flahum.org.